So welcome back, everybody. We are connected through Skype with Jeb Brugman in New York. So hello, Jeb. Hello again. And we thank you again so much for waking up very early, I must say, and agreeing to make your presentation at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is some sort of an academic achievement. And the technology seems to be cooperative so far. So we'll have your slides on the screen, and Jeb will appears on the bottom right of the screen. And so I hope the connection will be good. And so Jeb is the founder of ICLEI, as we already mentioned this morning, and he's now part of 100 Resilient Cities network and based in New York. He will tell us about that. And well, Jeb, if you're ready, you have the floor for something like half an hour or a little more if you want, and around half an hour, and then we'll have the same amount of time for discussion.
That's lovely. Good morning, everyone. I am sorry that I can't be there with you. It's actually my loss. Can you hear me? Is it all clear? Can I see some nodding heads if you can hear me? Good. Yeah, it's my loss, and it's not so bad getting up so early. It's better than sleeping a night on an airplane, so I'm not suffering at all, other than that I don't get the benefit of hearing your presentations. So what I want to do today, in keeping with the invitation, is not really to try to theorize the things that I've been involved in since the founding of ICLEI and even before in the 1980s. With the municipal foreign policy movement in the United States, but at least to provide some framings that are at least the framings that I use to try to understand where our practice is going. And so I speak to you as a practitioner and with somewhat, let's say, a historical observer, sometimes of some important moments in the development of city action on global issues that I think have not been well recorded. Especially those in the 1980s and 90s, before everything was documented in the internet. So it's very hard sometimes, lacking archives on the history of this, to go back and actually understand the origins of things and some of the twists and turns we experienced as we tried to develop this practice, cities acting on global problems. I'm just trying to activate my screen here. It's a little slow. So my involvement in this arena of international city networks or cities addressing international challenges begins in the early 1980s in the United States. And it's from that American experience that I have a specific vantage point. At the time in the 1980s, I was working for what one of the American presidents, the first President Bush, called the People's Republic of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my job as a city employee was effectively to be the head of the city's foreign policy as part of the peace movement of the time. So my department was the Commission on Nuclear Disarmament. What was it? The Commission on Peace and Nuclear Disarmament of the city of Cambridge, which of course was a very exotic thing. Even today it's an exotic thing. But one of the functions of my job and of the unit was to organize city leaders across the United States to address a number of policy issues of international concern during the era of the Reagan administration and for you in Europe, in particular the Thatcher years, where the American government was advocating a number of foreign policies that were seen as being contrary, at least by the political left, or the center left in the United States, as being contrary to the interests of cities themselves. And one of those policy movements of the time that we organized was sanctuary policies, whereby city governments in the United States passed local laws to not cooperate with the Federal Immigration Service to send were refugees back to Mala and El Salvador, where the United States was overseeing military interventions. And that sanctuary movement is still very alive today. I'm sure those of you who are in Europe are hearing some about it in the media if you're not studying correctly. We also, in that era, started the movement at the municipal level to get eventually federal government policy to change vis-a-vis the apartheid regime in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So that network was largely a national network. We called it Local Elected Officials for Social Responsibility, to mimic the name of the physicians' peace organization of the time, the Physicians for Social Responsibility, which won the Nobel Prize. But it, by the mid to late 80s, was a network of more than 600 elected mayors, city councilors of municipalities across the United States. And we had a methodology, which is a few of our cities would pass a new law of some kind, and then we would, in that way, test it out, and we would disseminate the text of that law to that broader network of 600 plus local officials, and then we scale it up very rapidly so that it would become a story in the media, it would create a tremendous policy debate, and eventually would often put pressure on the state level of government to pass similar policies. And when there were enough state governments doing so, ultimately put pressure on the federal government to change policy. So at that time, in the US context, and this was also happening elsewhere, at least in the Anglophone world, to a less degree, I think, but municipalities were claiming aspects of constitutional authority that had not been practiced by convention, and were also trying to extend their authority in areas that weren't necessarily constitutionally supported. I won't get into the details of constitutional law and the constitutional powers of local government in the United States. They vary widely by state. But one of the things we did when we were extending beyond what could be argued as having been legally established as a constitutional authority, is it led to us forming alliances with civil society movements. For instance, with the non-interventionist organizations were organizing against U.S. intervention in Central America. So local governments began to build out their network beyond the network of city leader to city leader to city leader, working in alliance with civil society movements. And in 1988, 1989, largely myself, just because I had gone through these years as a leader in that municipal foreign policy movement, decided to test out the idea that cities take the same approach to addressing global environmental problems. And the publisher of this journal, the Center for Innovative Diplomacy, that was headed by Michael Schuman, it was an NGO. There were some mayors involved in that too. Mayor Larry Agrin of Irvine, California. We got together and organized a meeting with the Nobel Prize winning chemist Sherwood Rowland to brief a group of mayors and city council members in August 1989 on what they could do to implement the Montreal Protocol, given that our national government, the U.S., was not taking action to implement the Montreal Protocol. And that led to yet another instance of cities creating this pressure on states and then states on the federal government to begin the implementation. And so by 1990, the U.S. Congress passed an act to actually establish how the government would phase out fluorocarbons. And that itself is a very interesting story of how within the course of less than a year, that municipal level pressure led to negotiations with the chemical industry, with DuPont and others, to accept a federal regulation of CSDs because they didn't want to operate in a market environment where cities and states were all establishing different regulatory standards. So we moved very quickly from August 1989, and I was contacted on the occasion of that meeting with Sherwood Rowland by the UN Environment Program, and they asked what could be done in order to accelerate this kind of city to city. It's on that basis that they agreed to allow us to host the founding Congress of ICLEI at the United Nations in 1990, September 1990. So within the course of a year, we moved from a very national movement to reaching out to, over the course of that year, I traveled internationally and met with other networks that have been forming in other countries around the world, and we formed an alliance with each other to establish ICLEI. And this is just a picture of the local government representatives at that UN meeting voting in favor of the charter of newly established ICLEI. What's, I think, important about this moment of the 80s to the early 90s is what we were really doing is establishing the voice of the local state as a voice in international policy making. We weren't really thinking beyond that we were policy-making bodies with constitutional authorities, that our voice should be heard, in this case, in international policy processes. And that leap from the local state to a seat at the table in international forums was, of course, a big leap and an unprecedented leap. In fact, this founding Congress at the UN was, I think, the first meeting that the UN itself had ever hosted in its own house in the United Nations facilities that was strictly a meeting of local government leaders. So there were some precedents being set. And from that period of 1990, we moved quickly into having a seat at the table in the Earth Summit in 1992 and getting the UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio to endorse and establish this notion of local authorities being a major group of stakeholders to the international community, and the endorsement of Local Agenda 21 as a sustainable, which in itself is an interesting story of how we built a network internationally through the ICLEI program and through linking with national associations of local government, scale up a planning process that was linked in principle to an international policy strategy, Agenda 21. At a critical time for local government.
Jeb, can you hear me?
Yes.
We have an echo.
Yes, I can.
In your after your voice, we have an echo. Did you change anything in the sound system? Or?
No, I didn't. But what I'll do, Olivier,
yes,
is I'll turn my sound off. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's better. If it's okay with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I won't be able to hear you now. Sorry for the technical challenges. I won't be able to hear you, so you'll have to wave to me in front of the screen if there's any further challenges.
Yeah, I will do that. Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. What was interesting about this period in the early 1990s is that we were pushing the barriers, the limits of the authority that a local government could have in international policy discussions. And there were many tensions. There were tensions over simple phrasings. So we were always, and I was very involved in the drafting of texts behind the scenes for the Earth Summit in 1992. And then even more involved, I'll speak to our in Habitat 2 in 1996. But we were given through friendly local government delegations the opportunity to look at the draft text and propose changes. And one of those changes to test the limits was to always change the language in the text from local authorities to local governments. And the phrase government, local government, was always rejected. So we ended up with local authorities as the concept of what our institutional sphere was, local governments. And China in particular was very vocal about saying that any reference to local government was a violation of their national sovereignty. So it was seen as a critical threshold that they would not want the United Nations to cross in accepting that local governments had unique status and unique mandate. Later, the development NGO community from the other side pressed against the language of local authorities in the text by negotiating a different concept, local communities, which another attempt to broaden out the sphere of the local that was recognized, but basically removing the recognition of the local state as being a critical actor. So during this period of time, and I put these figures here to illustrate it, what we were doing as local governments was a project to try to strengthen both the powers and the resources available to the local state to be actors in implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda and in translating the high-minded ideas in a document like Agenda 21 into a set of practices or scalable within an urban context. So you see here with these figures, this is a survey of local Agenda 21 activity that was done in 2001. You see that most of the origin of local Agenda 21 activity was from local governments directly or through local government organizations. There were national and international programs by the United Development Program, some NGO networks as well that were involved in local Agenda 21. But it was very significantly a process that was used by local governments and by national associations of local government that were now, of course, working in an international network sense to reestablish or strengthen the relationship between the local state and civil society, and of course, the state. But the whole way in which it was articulated as a network-based program was really about re-engaging, re-legitimating the local state. And if we think of the Thatcher years in the United Kingdom, as the process of neoliberal reform was unfolding and powers were being taken away by the local state and local utilities were being privatized, local Agenda 21 was very much used as a way of re-engaging, re-establishing that relationship between local councils in the UK and the local citizenry and local stakeholders in order to push against the decentering of the state at the local level. That went on until Habitat 2. And in Habitat 2, a new precedent was made. We managed to even get the opportunity to sit in the negotiations, both in the committee rooms and in side negotiations, directly negotiating texts with national delegations. In the Earth Summit process, our networking activity had us as one of the stakeholder voices that would get to insert things through our private relationships with national delegations or make statements at the end of the day along with the other major groups. But in Habitat 2, we were given a special status to sit in the negotiating room at a desk in the front of the room to make constant interventions in the negotiations throughout the day. So we pushed the complete limits of anything that had ever happened in terms of a voice for the local state in international policy making, all the way into the Habitat 2 process in Istanbul. At times there, in the working groups in Istanbul, there were text items where there was a disagreement between, in particular, the G77 countries, where China still had a heavy voice, and we as local government. And the chair of the working committees would actually have, I was in the room with 3 or 4 national government delegates, senior people, ministers, and representing local government, and 4 of us would hash out the language and bring it back to the room. There was a major reaction to that immediately following, and nothing of that nature has ever been allowed before. But it was an interesting instance of how, through this kind of activity that originated in the 80s, all the way through the Earth Summit, we made broke some tremendous ground in terms of a recognition of the local state as an actor in international affairs. One of the other pushbacks came from the right, and this is one illustration of it, but it took with a bit of delay. But the Tea Party movement and sort of far-right movements in the United States and elsewhere wrapped local Agenda 21 into a broader conspiracy theory of the United Nations, as this slide says, stripping good Americans of all personal rights and freedoms. In other words, the narrative of enslaving people through black helicopters in the UN. So this has had a dramatic impact on the politics of local action in the United States. Thankfully, not so much elsewhere, we hope. So then we move on. My slides are very slow. Excuse me. It will work. So it's during these years as well, of course, in the early 80s that we started working with cities to take action on climate change. And in the early 90s, there were 3 main networks. Claire has been there to speak about energy cities. ICLEI started the Cities for Climate Protection program. And then there was Klimabundes, which expanded to be the Climate Alliance, the 3 main networks that during the 1990s were networking and developing practices of cities to take on challenges of greenhouse gas emissions. This is purely notional. I think it would be interesting to have the data to track how what I would say are 3 communities of practice that are quite distinct, reflect very different domains of practice needed to be teased out, how they evolved with the growing number of cities that were making official commitment to develop climate action plans. And I can speak as ICLEI as a network at the time, is we found that we had to articulate the program in such a way that we were distinctly creating a network of networks. And I introduce this now because I think this is the main trend in which international global city programs taking on issues of sustainability are beginning to purposely design themselves. We didn't start cities for climate protection with communities of practice point of view. I don't think the theory of communities of practice existed in the late 1980s quite yet, but in effect that's what we did. We had a specific working process that engaged those who knew how to count the greenhouse gas molecules and distribute them and develop the protocols for measuring and viewing gases, so that by the mid-1990s we had software tools already being used by hundreds of local governments to do basic analysis. At the same time, we found that we needed a very distinct effort to develop the management capacity within local government itself to link this kind of technical analysis with planning, with policies, and working across different departments and utilities within the jurisdiction of the local government to figure out what measures they could each. And so we had very distinct programs and policies working with the managers. And then with the beginning of the negotiations of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we began organizing local elected leaders to have a distinct voice and to understand how to be influencers within the international negotiation process. And that involved a very different process. And so by 1996 in Kyoto, UN Cities for Climate Protection, if you were to look at how we articulated our program, we're running 3 communities of practice and making efforts to link them together in terms of both legitimizing the work in the scientific community, that we were credibly doing analysis of greenhouse gas emissions, and that analysis locally could scale up into the work of the IPCC, and that was a big undertaking. It took 10 years or more for the IPCC understand that the urban sector was a distinct source of origin of greenhouse gases as opposed to traditional siloed economic sectors. We had to have managers assume positions within local government, be leaders of greenhouse gas climate planning, and then we needed a strong cadre of elected leaders to participate in all of the main international negotiation meetings. And what's interesting is by 2000, when a paper was published by one of my colleagues at ICLEI, identified more than 1,000 cities that had made commitments to climate action plan, had at least started a climate action planning process, that the movement, the number of cities making commitments, was ahead of, I would say, the numbers of people who were really committed and working to implement those things. That we were still benefiting from the movement politics of the 1980s, getting cities to make these bold statements without the practice community really being there to help guide them to do something as simple and complicated as this. But through the maturing of all of these networks and the introduction of new ones, the Clinton Climate Initiative, C40, and the middle noughts around 2000 year in terms of a new generation of programs, the number of people in the practice world began to catch up. So to me, the community of practice framing is an interesting one that might offers further. Designed and financed the networks of networks. So within 100 resilient cities, we don't talk about
Jeb?
we talk about a collaborative planning and design and implementation program. And of course, this is a very different point in history where charitable organizations are putting major investments. 100 Resilience City started with a $150 million multi-year investment from the Rockefeller Foundation. I started ICLEI with $50,000. It was the profit that was made off the founding Congress in 1990. So it's a very different world. But it's a much more sophisticated world in terms of change processes. And it's a world that reflects the neoliberal reality we exist in. These programs aren't out there, as in the early ICLEI years, campaigning for recognition and understanding of the local state, per se. There isn't a discourse about the local state and its role in international affairs. The discourse is around how we create communities of practice through networking different networks together across industry, with local government, with a variety of actors at the table in order to develop major new, I would say, industrial interventions in urban development trends. So we've moved beyond pure politics, or what in my speaking title was called the diplomacy of cities, to an industrial process of, put it in a positive light, innovative change in the way that we industrially space, and the way in which we industrially manage urban space. So my job at 100 Resilient Cities now is managing the 100+ private sector and institutional partners who are offering free services of different kinds to support the cities that are coming up with these resilient strategies. But also at the table are 12 large engineering and planning firms like ARUP, AECOM, McKinsey is at the table, and others who are actually contracted service providers within the context of a city-based program to support the cities in their planning processes. So it's an entirely different reality that reflects for better and for worse, perhaps, the reality of a neoliberal city activism on global problems. I'll conclude by just highlighting some different aspects of this evolution, and maybe this gives some sense of direction of where things are going. So I think it's important to recognize that the work of cities on climate wasn't a standalone thing, that there have been a number of other agendas launched where communities of practice have come together specifically to test out and understand how to advance different areas of performance in cities internationally. And in the last decade, we still thought of these agendas as competing agendas with one another. So if you were an ICLEI or a climate-based city network, you had to have an opinion about smart cities and whether smart cities was competing with you because it was taking too much attention relative to the attention you were trying to get of a city administration. But I think what we see now is quite a different picture if we can stand back a little bit. I look at it more agnostically, that across different spheres of performance cities, there have been these laboratory, these learning communities that have all advanced a variety of different practices to prove the potential of cities to perform radically better than what we've understood urban space, urban community, and urban infrastructure to be able to perform. And I think that orientation towards, as we did in the climate world, said the city in the early 1990s, we would say a city could achieve a 7% reduction in its greenhouse gas emissions against a 1988 baseline year. And now most cities that get involved in the climate process are setting a target for 2030 of 80% reductions. That ability to move from 7 to 80% is the learning of a community that understands that through, let me continue to use this way of phrasing it, through a collaborative industrial process, we can achieve dramatically better performance in that area, and also in terms of health outcomes for the well and happy cities movement, in terms of resilience outcomes, in terms of efficiency outcomes, and things like that. So this is a way that I'm trying to understand where we're going as a broader urban movement these days. Here's another way of framing it, that in effect we could say that we've been on a learning curve to just understand broadly what the potential of urban space is from sustainability, natural resources management point of view. When we started the local Agenda 21 effort in the early 1990s, cities and even that effort itself were focused in on just managing the flows of resources through cities, how to reduce the pollution. It was that sort of end of pipe way of thinking. Local Agenda 21 basically introduced the idea that we could go upstream from those processes into a demand management process through integrated planning. We could create better systems. We could change behaviors so that there is less waste and pollution. And now our practices these days are really about circular economy, how you cycle resource flows in cities, all the way to how urban places through eco-districts, networks and processes, how eco-districts can be net exporters of food, net exporters of energy. And so this is a learning curve that begins to prove to us that urban space can perform in dramatically different ways than we've ever conceived before. It can actually, an urban community can have ecological function. It's not just something that is extracting resources from other communities and from nature, so to speak. But I put in these two boxes around this learning curve to highlight this again, that in the early years we were really thinking as city networks and understanding the practices of cities working with one another. And as we've gotten into this more advanced way of understanding the potential of cities, we're in a network of network space where the industrial networks, let's say what is it called, the insurance industry network that's run out of the University of Cambridge, where the insurers are getting together thinking about risk in cities, or World Business Council for Sustainable Development and others like this. Their network now with city programs, Global Infrastructure Basel as an industry network, and the infrastructure industry partnering very closely with city networks to think about the urban nexus practices within cities. It's not just city networks any longer who are leading the best practices here. And so when I speak with cities about where our practice is going and how we accelerate improvement performance or improvement of outcomes in cities, I often frame it up this way, that we've moved from that kind of policy-oriented way of claiming space, using authority, to thinking about how we convene design processes in order to get the elements of industry who want to help us achieve these new social performance agendas. I spent much of the last 14 years working with industry on how to introduce services, banking services to informal sector entrepreneurs in slums and cities, for instance. How we work with industry that is willing to think about our social agendas and our sustainability agendas, to design a new products, to develop the business models that allow them to deliver those products to market, but then as local governments create so-called market ecosystem, the enabling dimension that allows those new products and those new services to be scaled up and to compete with the legacy services and products in terms of housing and things like this that have been scaled internationally. And then through our network of networks programs, how we have strategic alliances between these different actors in order to scale it up. So what we've got now is an unmitigated neoliberal project to advance urban performance, and I'm a full participant in it. And in the 1990s, I was one of the main people arguing against my international NGO colleagues, who I would say were fully participating in the neoliberal project in the 1990s in their efforts to undermine our work to get the international community to be the way in which we could strengthen the local state. We're in opposition to the local state becoming a stronger, more dominant actor in international policy forums. When I met the international NGOs at Habitat 2, they were resentful of the level of participation and influence local authorities had gained. But now we're in a position where local authorities and industry are partnering very thoroughly in processes like this. And they're not just abstract processes, they're processes we've come to understand by looking back at what we've actually scaled that has been impactful. So if we think about the evolution of the whole realm of practice of brownfield redevelopment, which is no longer cutting edge, but it's one that we can study in great detail. What one can, if you look at the measures that were required in order for that realm of practice, which has been very significant in the United States, for instance, there were millions of inner city brownfield sites that were abandoned and toxic and having social impacts, not just environmental impacts, but we scaled the investment in those areas through vast innovation in the business in terms of liability insurance, in terms of how to do finance, in terms of how to clean soil, in terms of how to re-engineer sites. And then we created entirely new policy environments, legal reforms in terms of environmental liability law that enabled the scaling of those things. And we established networks, and those networks were locally within cities. They were at subnational scale, at national scale, and at international scale, with the scientific community, with the engineering community, with local government, and the development industry community. That's how we advanced one of the key practices that we take for granted today. So today, where I leave you is with this question. It's if we move now to a network of networks model where the focus is yes on policy reform, yes on planning, but even just as much so on business reform, on product reform, on investment reform. And we're working in that kind of way across all of these performance areas. The question is, where does this lead us? And one could project that we'll just keep launching new agendas and experimenting, and those different networks that are focused on different performance outcomes will network more and more with one another. But my guess would be that we're going to be changing the discourse, and that there's been significant enough learning about how to accelerate the process of urban innovation within a liberal market society context, that discussion will move towards broader notions of urban productivity. And I would argue it already is. The notion of urban productivity, or the productivity of cities, is already appearing, and it appeared in some of the background papers for the Sustainable Development Goals. There are new networks that are focusing on urban productivity, and by productivity, that's broadly defined as embracing these different agendas. It's productivity of households in terms of social development outcomes. It's the productivity of natural resource use, and the ability of cities to be natural resources, and its productivity from the point of view of, in particular, cities and city regions and countries that face the challenge. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'm getting a little note in front of the screen saying time is up, and I'm all finished. So I'll leave it at that, because you've asked me to speak a little bit about where things might be going, but that's my read of the trajectory. I hope that was a useful contribution to your discussions this morning.
So, who would like to ask the first question? Claire Roumet.
Yeah, maybe I'll go downstairs. So this is, oh, sorry. Hello. Now you're in big screen, so it's very scary. No, I'm Claire Roumet from Energy Cities, and I was wondering whether there is no, so you ended up with saying that now we are entered into a urban productivity agenda. Do you have, I see it, I mean, this is no, I'm not questioning the trends, but do you see any other path, any other way, something else that will develop? Because I don't like the agenda you propose.
It's not coming clearly enough so I can understand. So maybe, Olivier, you can speak closer to the computer or something.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. Or so, no, the question is if there is any other way. So you sketched a future going on to networks of networks on a urban productivity agenda. That's clearly, we can feel the trends, very, very heavy. But do you see any other kind of potential ways, alternatives to that? Because this is not specifically joyful.
I guess the story I tell is of a defeated person of the 20th century. That the other way people keep talking about, Benjamin Barber, for instance, in his last book, tries to reestablish this narrative of the city-state. And I don't think the city as the state, the local state, as a sphere of government in the context in which we're speaking today, I don't see any way in which it establishes greater authority and greater influence outside of its ability to change the rules of the market, and changing the rules of the market within the metropolitan context is done by finding actors in the market who are willing to design market-based solutions that deliver the outcomes that you seek to achieve as a local state. So the local state is setting the targets, but it deeply turns to the private sector if it's creative. If it's creative, turns to the private sector to even foster the tech startups that will create some disruptive shift in the way it performs. And I have to say, I can't remove myself. I've worked in a lot of places. Especially in Africa and India, I've worked on the ground in a lot of places. But I think I don't see any change there. In fact, I think the neoliberal turn is even stronger in those parts of the world. So, and China is as much a center of neoliberal urban development practice as the United States is center of. So I don't. Let me put it this way: I think we'll ride the neoliberal turn to collapse. I don't think until crisis hits will we come back to the era of the 1990s, where there could be a local government representative in a United Nations negotiating policy positions on behalf of the local state. I don't know if, I assume most of you think that's, you think of it in a similar way, but I see someone else has a question. And please tell me who you are, because I know your names, but your faces.
Yes, I will. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll sit down then. That's good. So my name's Harriet Bulkley, and I'm at Durham University.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So I had two questions. I really like your analysis, and it resonated with quite a lot of what I spoke about earlier today. So we'll send those slides, and you can have a look at that. The first, this sort of shift that you document in terms of the approach that cities are taking and the place that they now find themselves in this kind of world of networks. I think more broadly across climate governance, some people call it the fragmentation of authority. I don't think it's so fragmented as just diffuse kinds of authority, which are always created in relation. It's more a relational authority. But anyway, I think that's what explains it. But it seems to me that cities and city networks are still trying to use many of the kinds of tools that, say, ICLEI invented in the early 1990s of, comprehensive measurements, greenhouse gas protocols, develop all the knowledge you can first, survey your city, and then act. That seems very different from what you're suggesting is required, which is a kind of strategic intervention and then, roll from there. So I suppose one question is, are we using the right tools for the new era in which we're based, and how to challenge that? And I think the second question is, and probably one that is where some of the disquiet about your diagnosis comes from, which is about what about the aspects of climate change that we can't make into a market solution? What do we do with those?
Yeah. So I'll be very honest with you about the first question. I'm going to turn my sound off because it seems to be echoing again. Can you hear me okay? Good. I've really tried to, oops, why is that there? I've really tried to push ICLEI because I maybe have some unique influence there, maybe not any longer. I've really tried to push ICLEI on this point that their incumbency is something they have to overcome. And so, although it's been felt until recently as a competitive dynamic, this, let's say, take C40 as an example. C40 is a network established purely through the view of the neoliberal era, right? Or the Clinton Climate Initiative. It was all about bringing industry to the table Oh yes, and then the mayors. And of course the mayors are the front people for this kind of industrial effort. And then smart cities even more so. They don't even need mayors. Smart cities doesn't even really need mayors any longer. They talk to the mayors. Yeah, ICLEI is doing things that are antiquated in terms of the challenge we have before us, but I put it this way to ICLEI, in terms of the opportunity we have to try to squeeze what we can out of the time we live in. And so my idealized notion of this collaborative design process, which I illustrate by giving these case study examples of how it's actually worked. But of course, it's a way of just framing up a very complicated history when we talk about brownfields and how it evolved as practice. But what I'm trying to argue always with, and some local governments are there, but I think there's still a lot of learning, that the local government in this era has to develop a number of new levers to actually create the market ecosystem. And I give an example, for instance, with eco-districts practice. And one of my favorite mayors, Hans Merninghoff, from Hanover, Germany. Hans, as a child of the Green Party movement in the 1970s, who emerged to be the director of utilities and economic development, and finally the Lord Mayor of Hanover before he retired a few years ago, understood the ability of a city through land banking practices to define the terms of performance, and not only of performance in terms of sustainability, but in terms of affordability. If the municipality had enough control over assets to leverage industry to innovate according to those performance requirements. So the Kreuzberg Eco District, which is a unique project, in the very early stages of eco district network practice, but that they managed to basically develop high performance, even passive housing within Kreuzberg at a very affordable rent, so that new immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe and Turkey inhabit Kreuzberg, as opposed to the 1960 high-rises that were the product that they could inhabit before. That was them leveraging local powers. And so my argument is that what we need to look at is all of these mechanisms that a local state can recapture if they've not entirely lost them, in order to leverage the market. And that's more than policy. And that's, of course, much more than mayors being in Paris for a photo shoot, which creates a narrative, but it doesn't change the market whatsoever. So that's why I'm trying to co-opt. What I'm trying to do is, a activist of the left is to co-opt a narrative and insert some new practices around how we leverage the state's assets in order to change industrial practices. And the word productivity, it's a kind of neutral term. Everyone wants to talk about productivity, so it's at least a convening word, and it undoubtedly will have unintended consequences that I'll feel ashamed of as one who's promoting it, such as the world we live in.
Yes, Michele?
Hi, Jeb. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Michele Acuto.
Hi. It's lovely to see both of you. I really regret not being able to meet, but I hope we will get to meet because, of course, your work is always in front of me.
Well, no, I'm glad actually you picked up Ben's bulletin and you put it up there. That's good that we're flagging a bit more on the bulletin. And the work that was now 30 years old. And
so it's not entirely clear, just the sound. So maybe hold the mic very closely.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Looming slow. Okay. I guess my question was, you said, so you're speaking of the 1990s Istanbul and Rio, and you're speaking about local government pushing the limits, being allowed in the room, maybe even putting a hand up slightly at the back of the room, the diatribe, local government, the local authority. Now, I fast forward that to Quito and to Habitat and to Paris. The concern there is, so there hasn't been much of despite all the pushing of the limits, what's changed practically in terms of governance terms? And where do you push the envelope on governance? Because it seems pretty similar to me then.
Yeah, it sort of died in 1996, I would argue. And I think we overplayed our hand a bit because there was such a resentment coming out of Istanbul. Oops, I'll turn my sound off. There was such a resentment coming out of Istanbul that I think I don't really know how it's managed within the UN, but it was a precedent that is a point of reference within the UN system, basically to never allow that again in terms of that level of engagement in the negotiations. And then other things have happened. The right-wing movement in the United States, for instance. So not only do we have China being very protective of its centralized state position and not any, I don't know, do Chinese mayors even come to these events? They have a lot of economic independence. There's not been a lot of participation in these international networks. But now on the US side, and this is preceding Trump, the Tea Party movement that had people appearing in city halls across the United States attacking ICLEI. I failed to mention that in the mid to late 1990s, the states of New Hampshire, Georgia, Kentucky, and Texas considered legislation to make it legal for local governments to join ICLEI. Because ICLEI was part, and I believe the bill passed in Kentucky, but equally chilling, the Republican Party in the 1990s established a policy platform against ICLEI in the Agenda 1 and Local Agenda 21. So in that political context, you can find even an Obama administration supporting a strong local voice, whereas my involvement in the first summit was during the George Bush administration. And when I mentioned that there were governments that would show me the negotiating text and ask me if I would change any language, they allowed me to insert language into the text during the Bush administration. But during the Obama years, actually, to be fair, the State Department negotiators for the climate convention did brief us, and we did have meetings in the White House. There's no question about it. But I don't think there was that kind of text negotiation involvement during this at all. It was really, what happened is the local governments got used to be people who would give speeches about how the economic benefits were positive. So it was to legitimize their positions and undermine the economic arguments against them. I hope, Michelle, that's useful. We can always talk more about these things.
We have time for one or two more short questions. Yes, if you can use the mic, speak slowly, face the camera.
All right. Hi. My name is Florence from Strasbourg. I have a very short question. First, thank you very much for your talk. And yes, what kind, because you speak from about productive city agenda. What kind of skills?
Which agenda?
What kind of skills? What kind of new skills, social competencies and skills, would you maybe design through all these years? You know, because mostly when some speaks about city becomes global actors, it's mostly really like, yeah, like a kind of designing a big structure and, you know, big organigrams and I'm not a science of politics, so I'm sociologist, and I'm really interested in what kind of skills, what kind of social skills through these years could you draw through your experience, please, if
Yeah.
it makes some sense.
Yeah, and let me ask to clarify, by social skills, do you include technical skills or
Yes, of
organized
course. Yes,
technicals
yes.
as well? Yeah. Well, I think this is where the notion of city networks or communities of practice still is very essential. And my guess is we just have to network the right things, network the right practices in order to scale up the learning process within the cities themselves. To address your question, so there's two aspects of that. Well, there's three aspects. One is to specifically create networks that are focused in on learning how to leverage the market. Right, because there's not I don't know of any city convenings taking place where the explicit focus is on how do we create urban markets. And my pyramid is an effort to proselytize on that front, to sort of say, here's a form of design, and the form of design is very complicated. It's strategic. It's how we do social organizing and how we link socializing, organizing with policy making and regulation of markets, and how we match regulation of markets with the products that we want to be scaled up in our market. As opposed to, like you said, design is the thing, right? Design is industrial design, and what I'm really saying is no, we're market designing. And we have many examples of cities that have done that. The Hanover one is an example. But the Hanover story is never told by the city networks as a story of market design. It's always told as a story of passive housing scale or something like that. So I think that's is something we should get on. We should develop those networks and learning communities around doing that. And what's interesting, again, with this total ambivalence of one living in the era that we ended up in, is that we're sort of post-neoliberal, right? It's done. The end of history kind of happened, sort of thing. To your first question, is there any alternative? Maybe not. It's really about figuring out how we can get the most. For me, it's very American. I'm a pragmatist. That's my philosophical orientation. Meaning truly as a school of philosophy, pragmatism. But we can find partners in the private sector. Sometimes it's in the startup community. Like one of the key issues in all cities. Let's take complicated cities, even in India. Let's take Mumbai, and look at Slum Dwellers International, what they're doing in Mumbai, right? So when Slum Dwellers International went from social advocacy and sort of rights to the city platform, and of course still that's the foundation, to actually engaging with Citibank to get finance to build housing in Dharavi. The first thing they did is built the worst standard modernist high-rise housing imaginable. It's maybe the worst modernist building on the market in Dharavi was built by Spark and Slum Dwellers International. Spark. No one wanted to live in this building because they didn't do design. They didn't design it for people who make their livelihood in a small living unit, right? And they recognize this. So now they've engaged with the design schools, with the schools of architecture, with the industries that are developing materials, with new financial actors on the market. And in Pune, they're doing something different. They're doing modular, self-built communities with high standard of building quality and safety and operating systems in the buildings, right? And flexible buildings so that they can be designed for different workshops. So in effect, they're doing what I would call strategic design, because they're still dealing with the policy landscape and they're still dealing with the political landscape as well when they're designing product. But I give this example to you to say that even a Slum Dwellers International can find an industry partner who will partner with them to design the solution that can deliver the social outcomes that they're seeking. And so whether one ever overcomes the ambivalence of the era that we've ended up in, it's clear that it can be used to drive outcomes in a market environment. I hope that rambling answer somehow is told. Okay.
Is there one quick last question to Jeb before? Yes, please. You can move forward if you'd like, or...
I think, can you hear me, Jeb? I'm just 2 rows behind.
Speak slowly and I can hear through the echo.
Okay, hi. I am Laura Vence, and I have a quick follow-up question that I think links up to the previous one about the kind of research policy interface and kind of jumping on your last comment that you said even SDI can find an industry partner. Where are the universities and where are the research units in that? And also kind of within your resilient city model, there is a lot of direct interface between the cities and the resilience offices and the companies and the strategic partners. But I don't see explicitly where universities and research institutions fit in there, or are they kind of a given and they kind of create this sphere of knowledge around it? I just wanted to know where you would position that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think there are a few, again, the university is many different types of animals, right? So there are unique programs, particularly in the schools of design. The very industry-facing programs, I find that there's a pretty regular interaction. So, for instance, I just gave a talk a week or so ago at City University, New York, which has a new advanced science technology center, and the senior faculty there are longtime faculty. They've been, one is the head of environmental science at City University, so they're not unusual academics in many respects, but they have a center which is really to interface with the practice world much more. I think the story with the role of the university and the academy in the development of local climate action is an interesting one. In the first instance, the cities, the activist city that we were at the time, the green within the city administration that we were at the time, was so far ahead in anyone's conception of what a city ought to do. In 1990, it was a very, very strange thing still to talk about cities taking on climate change. And so my frustration at the time is that the academy wasn't even paying attention. It wasn't a legitimate activity. And like I said, the IPCC, I think it wasn't until the 4th report that these were even noted. Because the points of reference analyzing things, the categories for analyzing hadn't conceived the city as an actor or urban systems as the system, right? So the scholarship on local climate action has been lacking because it wasn't paying attention for the first almost 10 years. And when I go back I'm trying to write a kind of historical piece about it now, which I happily will share with all of you when I'm sure it's making sense. Because there was no internet, there is no archive. And so the history of this doesn't exist. They're just trying to, but the academy did not help us document, right? And then there was this explosion in the noughts of the academy taking interest in this action, which was an explosion that happened along with the popularization of this field by Bill Clinton and Al Gore. So there's something that happened there that may be just a historical incident, and I hope it's not repeated now. To come to your question, like, how do we accelerate this conversation? This is why I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning as a practitioner, right? Because I think it's a really important conversation. And again, I think we know how to do it. We just have to give attention to forming a relationship with one another. And I'll make a final comment on it. In 100 Resilient Cities, which is this very network of networks thing with all kinds of resources at its disposal and powerful connections at its disposal, I would say I've been there 3 months. I've heard it come up, say, 6 times in conversations. It's so hard to get the how do we get the universities to work with our cities, with the 100 cities? Is there some way we can partner with them? Because we have some problem and it needs some more fundamental research than one of our private sector partners is going to allocate resources to. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think the demand for it is on the city network side, as hopefully as much as you're feeling it on the university side.
Have to switch the mic on. It's a nice thing to reflect on in the rest of the day and in the coming months and years. If there's no other question for Jeb, we'll just end the session now. Jeb, thank you very much.
Can I just say one other thing to this?
Yeah,
last
sure.
point?
Yeah, please do.
You know, because I think the academy, especially from the social sciences perspective, has been very focused in on the critique of liberalization, right? And the city has been an agent, sometimes very active agent of liberalization, sometimes an unwitting agent of liberalization. So I think that the theorizing around it creates a barrier to a conversation in some way. And I don't think the critique is wrong. The critique is correct, right? But somehow it's not one that those living in the political world can engage with very well. Because they have to work with the discourse of the world that they're operating in. And the world that they're operating in has a very different discourse to it than the one that the academy has. And so I think that's part of the communication breakdown that we have, is that, like, even the introductory document, like, I love reading the introductory paper for this whole series of events you have, right? But the language of it is one that one has to get very familiar with and comfortable with. It's not one that you can bring to the mayor's office. And so that's why we end up with these kind of advanced research centers or incubators, things like that, you know, counterparts. But the social science researchers are doing research of us, right? But aren't engaged necessarily with us as partners in understanding the difficult reality we're trying to make change in. So maybe that's a topic for discussion too.
Thank you. Yet my perception is that, and especially in this area of research, you have social scientists that are both critical and very keen or eager to engage in action, even in co-production of action. So I think you'll find people to talk with, even critical social scientists that will be keen to talk and collaborate with your network. So, and that will be a nice thing to do, certainly, an important thing to do. Well, thank you very much, Jeb. The sound connection was not always very good, but we got the key, your key arguments, and certainly it was very valuable. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. And please,
please all be in touch with me. We can, if you're ever in New York or if I'm in your cities, let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Have a nice day.